All right, so have you ever had one of those days where you just feel like everything is going wrong?
Absolutely.
Like you spilled your coffee and your train was delayed, and then
Yeah.
you get to work and your computer crashes?
Ugh, the worst.
Well, that's bad and all, but imagine this. It's a frigid January day in Boston back in 1919.
Okay.
You're strolling through the North End, maybe thinking about grabbing some cannolis or some fresh pasta,
That's nice.
and suddenly, bam! You're hit by a 25-foot tall wave of molasses.
Whoa, hold on. A 25-foot wave of molasses. What are you talking about?
That's right, a wave of molasses. And that, my friend, is exactly what we're diving into today.
Okay, I am intrigued.
The Boston molasses flood of 1919.
Now, that's a story I haven't heard before.
It sounds crazy, right? Like something out of a Roald Dahl book.
It does.
But we're going to uncover the how and the why of this sticky situation.
All right, I'm all ears.
We've got a fantastic episode of Wondery's American History Tellers to guide us. And
Oh, I love that podcast.
me too. It's so well produced.
Yep.
But this isn't just some wacky historical footnote.
Right.
This story is about human choices, corporate responsibility, and the unexpected consequences of, well, cutting corners.
So, what can we learn from a flood of molasses?
I know it sounds bizarre, but trust me, this is a cautionary tale with some surprisingly relevant lessons for today.
All right, you got my attention. Let's dive in.
So, picture it. Boston, 1919.
Okay.
The city is still recovering from the Spanish flu and World War I.
A lot going on.
Yeah, at the time of rebuilding, you could say.
Right.
And right in the heart of the city's bustling North End.
Okay.
A primarily Italian immigrant community, by the way.
Interesting.
They build this massive steel tank.
A tank? What for?
Molasses.
Molasses, what for, baking?
Well, baking rum, but in this case, it was a key ingredient for making industrial alcohol.
Industrial alcohol, huh? What was that used for back then?
Munitions, primarily.
Munitions. So this is all tied to the war effort.
Exactly. World War I had just ended, and the demand for molasses was through the roof.
Wow, I never realized molasses played such a vital role.
It was literally fueling the war effort.
So that's why they needed this giant tank.
Yep. This thing was 50 feet tall, holding 2.5 million gallons of molasses.
2.5 million. That's enormous.
Enough to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool 5 times over.
Wow. So they just plopped this massive tank right in the middle of a neighborhood.
Well, yeah, pretty much. And that's where things start to get a little dicey.
Okay, I have a feeling this isn't going to end well.
Now, you might think building a giant tank to hold millions of gallons of liquid would require some serious engineering know-how, right?
I mean, you'd think so.
But get this, the man in charge of the whole project was Arthur P. Gell, the company treasurer.
Wait, the treasurer? Not an engineer?
Nope. 0 engineering experience.
Are you serious? That's like asking your accountant to build a rocket ship.
And it gets worse. They were rushing the whole project, trying to get it up and running as fast as possible to meet that wartime demand.
So they're cutting corners.
Big time. Safety concerns were ignored. Workers complained about shoddy construction. And guess what?
Right.
The tank was leaking from day one.
Leaking. How bad are we talking here?
Bad enough that neighborhood kids were collecting the leaking molasses in buckets.
No way. Seriously.
There were even reports of the tank groaning and shuddering like it was under immense strain.
Oh, man. That's a recipe for disaster.
And the worst part, there were warnings.
Warnings.
Yeah.
People tried to tell them something was wrong.
Yeah. One worker, Isaac Gonzalez, he had experience with molasses from his time in Puerto Rico.
So he knew his stuff.
He knew this tank was a disaster waiting to happen, and he voiced his concerns repeatedly. He was ignored, dismissed as an overreaction.
Oh, that's just awful.
Yeah, they just wouldn't listen.
This is already making me anxious, and we haven't even gotten to the flood yet.
So we've got a community trying to rebuild, a vital wartime resource, a massive, shoddily built tank, ignored warnings, and a company prioritizing profit over safety.
Well, this is not going to end well.
And it was only a matter of time before that recipe came to a boil. Literally.
Oh, man, here we go.
Okay, so we've got this ticking time bomb in the North End, and we know it's going to blow. But how did it actually happen? What was the trigger?
Well, it was an unseasonably warm day in Boston that day, January 15th, 1919.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the temperature climbed up above 40 degrees Fahrenheit.
So like a heat wave for January in Boston?
Pretty much. And that's a crucial detail here. See, that tank had been sitting there for weeks in freezing temperatures. All that molasses had thickened up in the cold.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. So suddenly you've got this warm day, and all that thick, cold molasses starts to warm up and expand rapidly.
Like shaking up a soda bottle and then popping the top.
Exactly. And the tank, well, just wasn't built to handle that kind of pressure.
Oh man, I can already feel the tension building.
And then just after lunchtime, with a deafening roar that was heard for miles, the tank just gave way.
The podcast described it as sounding like an earthquake, followed by this massive wave of molasses just surging through the streets.
25 feet high, moving at 35 miles an hour.
Can you imagine?
It's mind-boggling, the force of that wave just ripping through the north end, crushing buildings, sweeping people off their feet.
There is debris and twisted metal everywhere, and the air was thick with the smell of molasses.
A chaotic, terrifying scene.
The podcast shared some really harrowing accounts from survivors.
I bet.
Like, there was this woman, Maria Ann Tasca, walking home with her 2 young sons when the wave hit.
Oh, no.
One of her boys was swept away right in front of her. She never found him.
Oh, that's just heartbreaking.
And there were so many stories like that. Families torn apart, people injured, trapped in the wreckage.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of the devastation.
21 people died that day. Over 150 were injured.
It's a tragedy.
And you can imagine how difficult the rescue efforts were. I mean, you've got this thick, sticky molasses everywhere, making it hard to move, to see, to breathe even.
Right, and it was starting to cool and harden, which would have made it even more difficult for rescuers to reach people.
They had to use horses to try and pull the wreckage apart.
Oh, wow.
And some of the horses were so badly injured that they had to be euthanized right there on the scene.
Oh, that's awful.
It took days to clean up the mess, and even then the smell of molasses lingered in the North End for months afterward.
Wow, a haunting reminder of the tragedy.
So now we've got this massive disaster. The aftermath is just chaos and heartbreak, but then the question becomes, who is responsible for this?
Right, someone has to be held accountable.
And it seems pretty clear that USIA, the company that owned the tank, is at fault.
Yeah, with the faulty construction, the ignored warnings, the rush to prioritize profit over safety.
But get this, their initial response was unbelievable.
What did they do?
They tried to blame anarchists.
Anarchists.
Seriously.
Yep, they claimed that the tank had been sabotaged by political radicals trying to stir up trouble.
Wow, talk about deflecting blame.
It was a desperate attempt to capitalize on the political climate at the time.
Ah, so this was during the Red Scare. Exactly. Anti-communist sentiment was running high, and they tried to use that to their advantage.
That's cynical, but I guess not surprising given the stakes.
Right. They were facing potential lawsuits, criminal charges even.
But surely no one believed that anarchist story.
Well, it didn't really fly. The evidence of their negligence was just too overwhelming.
Yeah, you can't just blame anarchists for a shoddily built tank.
And people were outraged. I mean, this was their community, their homes, their lives that had been destroyed.
So they demanded justice.
They did, and that's when things get really interesting because this disaster sparked one of the largest class action lawsuits of its time.
A class action lawsuit.
Yeah, where a group of people with similar claims band together to sue a defendant.
So all the victims of the Molasses flood joined forces to sue USIA.
Exactly. It was a landmark case.
I bet USIA wasn't too happy about that.
Oh, they fought it tooth and nail. They had a whole army of lawyers trying to downplay their responsibility.
It sounds like a classic David versus Goliath situation.
It really was. And at the heart of this legal battle was this incredible lawyer, Damon Hall.
Tell me more about him.
He was a real bulldog in the courtroom, absolutely relentless in his pursuit of justice for the victims.
That's what you want in a lawyer, someone who won't back down.
Exactly. And he was brilliant. He meticulously built his case, brought in expert witnesses to testify about the tank's faulty construction.
And he highlighted the human cost of the disaster, right?
Absolutely. He wanted to make sure everyone understood that this wasn't just about property damage. This was about real people who had lost their loved ones, their homes, their livelihoods because of USIA's negligence.
So what happened? Was he successful?
So we've talked about the disaster itself, the court battles, the impact on building codes, but there's one part of this story that I keep coming back to.
You mean Isaac Gonzalez?
Exactly. The guy who tried to warn everyone. His story, it's almost Shakespearean, you know?
Tragic hero.
Yeah, it's like he had the knowledge, he saw it coming, but no one would listen.
And it wasn't just some hunch he had. He had real expertise. He'd worked with molasses before down in Puerto Rico, so he knew how dangerous it could be.
It's like he was a whistleblower before we even had that word.
And it's frustrating, right? Because his warnings were ignored.
Totally. Dismissed as an overreaction. It makes you think how many disasters, big or small, could be prevented if people in charge just, listen to the folks who actually know what's going on.
Right. It happens all the time, even today. Think about the engineers who warned about the Challenger space shuttle.
Exactly. Or whistleblowers in all sorts of industries trying to expose wrongdoing.
It's like this constant struggle, isn't it? Between those who have power and those who are trying to speak truth to that power.
Yeah, and in this case, it's USIA, this huge company focused on profits and production, versus Isaac Gonzalez, just a regular worker trying to warn them about a potential disaster.
And they just wouldn't hear it. I mean, Isaac wasn't even trying to shut everything down. He just wanted them to take some basic precautions.
And think about it, if they had just listened, if they had investigated his concerns even a little bit, this whole tragedy could have been avoided.
Totally. It really underscores the importance of listening to those who have firsthand knowledge, even when it's inconvenient or, might affect the bottom line.
It makes you think, what kind of systems can we create where people feel empowered to speak up and where those in charge are actually open to listening?
That's the big question, right? How do we encourage transparency and accountability?
Because I think this whole molasses flood thing, as weird as it sounds, it's actually a reminder that history isn't just about big events, it's about the choices people make.
Absolutely. And sometimes those choices have consequences that ripple outwards in ways we can't even imagine.
So, to all our listeners out there, I'd say be curious, be informed, don't be afraid to ask questions and speak up when you see something that doesn't seem right.
Your voice matters.
Exactly. And if you want to learn more about this whole crazy story, definitely check out the American History Tellers episode. It's a wild ride.
It'll leave you thinking long after it's over.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning the world around you.
See you next time.